I'm Peggy Hamburg. I'm going to be moderating this session on outsmarting superbugs. What are the alternatives? I'm the Foreign Secretary for the U.S. National Academy of Medicine and recently also served as the Commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration. And in both those roles, certainly have had the opportunity to work on this important issue. And we're joined this morning by a very expert and distinguished panel. And I will be letting them do most of the talking. But we are fortunate to have this group, and maybe I'll just quickly introduce them. You have, I think, more extensive bios in your meeting materials. But to my right is Matthew Hepburn, Program Manager, Biological Technologies off at DARPA, and then Peter Jackson, the Executive Director of the AMR Center in the UK, Nancy Knight, who comes to us from the Centers for Disease Control. She's the Director of the Division of Global Health Protection there, Jeannette Mucha, co-founder and CEO of CyBac Inc., emerging biotech company, and Peter Piot, known probably to most of you, the Director of the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine and Handa Professor of Global Health. So we are really addressing a very important and timely topic here this morning, antimicrobial resistance, and what kinds of strategies and solutions we need to be pursuing. Probably most of you know what AMR is, but just to be clear in terms of why this matters so much to public health, to medicine, to our economy, and to our future, why some people describe it as the most pressing public health challenge of our age, and some refer to it as an existential threat, in fact, to our futures. Antimicrobial resistance is the ability of microbes to resist the effects of medication that once could successfully treat them. The challenge that infections that once could be treated with available antibiotics now can't be. And resistance can arise, of course, through natural mechanisms. Microbes are always evolving, and they are mutating in response to a range of pressures. In terms of the growing challenge of antimicrobial resistance that we are talking about, most of those pressures that are causing resistance are coming from our species, humans, in terms of a number of different factors, how we're using antibiotics, overuse and inappropriate use of antibiotics in the healthcare setting and beyond. Also, the excessive and inappropriate use of antibiotics in animal health and agriculture, often for growth promotion and prevention of disease, as animals are being raised in crowded settings. Also, of course, for treatment of disease. Also, as a former FDA commissioner, I have to add poor quality and substandard drugs that don't have enough active ingredient are contributing to our problem, and we see that a lot in low-income countries in particular, and with disease conditions such as malaria. It's a very significant concern, and also environmental exposures to antibiotics, the unfortunate dumping of effluents from pharmaceutical manufacturing sites, animal waste, and other things. So there's a complex ecosystem that is feeding antimicrobial resistance, and the toll is huge and growing. It's estimated that some 700,000 to several million deaths result each year due to antimicrobial resistance, and needless to say, the cost to humans and to economies of all nations is significant as well. And without more responsible stewardship of existing antimicrobial drugs, as well as the development of new ones, it's estimated that some 10 million people per year will die by 2050, and the costs to the economy will be measured in tens of trillions. So it is not surprising that there has been increasing attention to this issue, and I would have to report that there's quite a lot that's going on now, but much more needs to be done, and that's what we're going to be talking about today at the global level, at the national level, at the local level. And we're going to be focusing a lot in the hour that we have on new medical product development, new drugs, diagnostics, vaccines, new therapeutic approaches, but also talking about how we can be more responsible stewards of existing antibiotics and how we can create systems to really ensure our future in terms of this pressing public health challenge. So let me turn now to our panelists. And first we will hear from Nancy Knight from the CDC, who's going to help us put this into a public health context. I also do want to mention, taking perhaps part of what her message was going to be, but the U.S. Centers for Disease Control has issued a year-long AMR challenge to combat the rise of antimicrobial resistance with over 100 organizations, government, private industries, and civil society around the world committing to this important effort. And the Milken Institute and Faster Cures, along with many others, has joined this effort, is a dedicated partner in this effort, and is very, very proud of the contributions that they can make, will make, and this session is, of course, a part of trying to bring greater visibility, urgency, and action to this issue. So with that, let me turn to my colleague, Nancy Knight.
Thank you. I think I'd like to underscore a few of the points that you made, Peggy, because antimicrobial resistance is such a critical threat, not only now, but going into the future. The WHO considers antimicrobial resistance as one of the top 10 public health threats today. As Peggy mentioned, there are more than 700,000 deaths annually, globally, from antimicrobial resistance. This includes 230,000 deaths from tuberculosis, a disease that many of you probably don't think about on a daily basis, but is killing hundreds of thousands around the world. And if you Google superbugs, which I did last night, to kind of see, what's being said about superbugs in the media today, you'll come up with, you'll see that superbugs is something that's being discussed today and on a regular basis going back. So most recent hits on Google for superbugs, I got more than 94,000 hits in the news. The top one was, our antibiotics are no match for superbugs, and it's a global crisis, from the UN report. That's from April 29th from CNN. Countries need to step up their efforts against superbugs, also from April 29th from The Telegraph. How to fight scary superbugs, cooperation and a special soap. That's from April 12th from the Kaiser Health News. And so I had to read, what's this special soap, right? Chlorhexidine. Drug-resistant superbugs are spreading, but your hospitals don't have to tell you. April 8th from Vox. And you can keep going and going and going. Superbugs are a critical threat to all of us. In the United States, out of those 700,000 deaths that are occurring globally, in the United States, we have more than 23,000 deaths annually from superbugs. We have more than 2 million infections that are caused annually in the United States. As Peggy said, that is going to grow. That 700,000 is going to grow to 10 million by 2050. 10 million people will die in 1 year by 2050 if we don't change what we're doing today. That's just as many people or more than as many people that are dying from all types of cancer today. So think about the impact of cancer, and that will be the impact of superbugs in the future if we don't change things. But it's also going to have a tremendous effect on our economy, as was also mentioned. The economic impacts will put us into a crisis that feels and looks similar to the 2008 financial crisis. But unlike the 2008 financial crisis, it's not going to be cyclical because antimicrobial resistance will be there to stay if we don't address it now. We will see global exports that could decrease by as much as 3.8% annually. Global healthcare costs will increase to more than $1 trillion. And there will be a loss of about 5% of GDP in the low-income countries in the world, and 28 million more people that will be living in extreme poverty. So take a step back and think about the impacts on health, the impacts on the economy, the impacts on society, all the way from a global level down to your family. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about superbugs. So as Peggy mentioned, at CDC, we have the AMR Challenge. This was launched last year by our Department of Health and Human Services and CDC to help bring attention to this issue of antimicrobial resistance and to gather partners from around the world, from all sectors, to be a part of the AMR Challenge. We have the Milken Institute that has partnered to make sure that there are sessions like this and others at all of their gatherings going forward, and we really appreciate that partnership. We have other partners from across private sector organizations. We have CVS's Minute Clinics, which will prioritize patient education in their 3,000 sites. We have Doctors on Demand that will decrease unnecessary antibiotic prescribing practices for upper respiratory infections by 20% by the end of this year. Petco has committed to not allow prophylactic use of antibiotics in its supply chain. Walmart as well is working with their animal protein suppliers in order to report and improve upon antibiotic use in its supply chain throughout all of its more than 5,000 stores. Carbex is investing $80 million by the end of this year to support more than 40 drug diagnostic and vaccine development projects. And we also have more than public health institutions across the world. We have other countries' governments that are signing on to this. We have local and state public health departments in the United States. We have human health, we have animal sector, all signing up to be a part of the AMR Challenge. So our challenge to you is to become a part of this partnership. And you can go to arx@cdc.gov, send an email to Alpha Romeo X-ray @cdc.gov to sign on to be a partner in the Antimicrobial Resistance Challenge. I'll turn over to you.
Okay, thank you. Well, I want to now turn to Peter Piot, who has worked for many, many years on some of the most pressing and difficult infectious disease threats, and has worked both in academia and with important international organizations to give us your sense of what are the global implications? We've been hearing about some of them. How is the problem of antimicrobial resistance worsening the challenge of dealing with a whole range of other existing infectious diseases that burden our globe? And tell us a little bit about some of the work that you've been involved in.
Yeah, thanks, Peggy. And just to totally support what Nancy said, I mean, this is a crisis in not just in making, it's already there, it's starting, and in the US, but it also has some major global dimensions. And frankly, what's happening with antimicrobial resistance is that it exacerbates the burden of let's call it now classic infectious diseases. And when you look at the big three, the HIV/AIDS, TB, and malaria, they're all, the control of them are going to really become more and more difficult because of the development of resistance. And a few weeks ago, there was a front page article in the New York Times on antimicrobial resistance, how it affects the poor in a slum in Nairobi, in Kibera, where I used to work 40 years ago, something like that. So you've got this really vicious circle because of an environment that's really very poor in terms of hygiene and sanitary environment. There's a high burden of disease, enteric infections, respiratory infections. Hence, people have more infections, need more antibiotics. Not always relevant because some of these are viral infections, but they can't afford the full course. They go to a local kind of pharmacy, chemist in a kiosk, take a few, what they can afford. And some of them are counterfeit drugs, as Peggy mentioned. And that's really an incubator for antimicrobial drug resistance. And that's for, let's say, the classic bacteria. But in addition, when you look at, take malaria, one of the big killers in the world, in Southeast Asia, there is now a growing burden of resistance to artemisinin. Artemisinin is a plant-derived medicine that really revolutionized the treatment of malaria, when the old treatment of chloroquine, this is a déjà vu, became resistant. The malaria parasite became resistant to chloroquine, and so you've got in parts of Cambodia and parts of Thailand and Burma, you've got now untreatable malaria infections, and that is something that we couldn't imagine a few years ago. And that's not really on the agenda of the AMR, agenda, because that's mostly dealing with Western countries and hospital-based and acquired infections and so on. TB, Nancy mentioned it. We've got now not only multi-drug-resistant TB, so-called MDR, but also XDR, that's extremely drug-resistant TB. And I know, Nancy, you worked in South Africa with our school. We work a lot in countries that are endemic for both HIV and TB, because there's a TB epidemic that follows as its shadow the HIV epidemic, because of people's immune system is depressed, so they the infection with TB becomes disease. But there we now have, frankly, very, very difficult to treat infections. And the problem is that we're talking about so-called third-line therapy for TB with very old drugs that are very toxic. People who survive, and the survival is only like 30 to 40% in the best places. You're deaf. There are lots of problems with it. And for TB, I mean, the first new drugs against TB that came on the market since I was a medical student, and that's quite a while ago. I was in the 70s, 60s, 70s. They only came on the market a few years ago, bedaquiline and others. So and they're not yet widely available. So there's been also a lack of investment in new drugs. So that's TB, and that's a big worry I have. We have in London, in our school, we have this, we take care of the infectious disease wards and for tropical diseases, and we regularly see a case of a multi-drug resistant TB. And it's always panic, what to do, how to, because it's contagious. And, by definition, including for healthcare workers. And then thirdly, HIV. And I think here, there is huge evolutionary pressure on HIV. About 20 million people in the world are taking antiretroviral drugs. And that's great. Because of that, they're alive. They would all be dead by now, most of them. And thanks to innovation and to this therapy. But that, the virus, HIV mutates all the time. And so it will try to, to survive. And because the raison d'etre of a virus is survival and long life. And so there are more and more drug-resistant infections, HIV, drug-resistant. Fortunately, we have new drugs that are coming up, and here the incentive is there because there is quite a big market in high-income countries to make antiretroviral drugs. But the HIV community is a bit in denial about this problem of HIV-resistant infections. And it's not only in people who are failing to take their treatment regularly and so on, because when you're under antiretroviral therapy, you really need to take your therapy every single day. I take statins, like probably half of the room here, and you know, and if you forget one day, fine, no problem. But with HIV and antiretroviral therapy, that's different. And there are you know, supply chain interruptions and all problems. So we have new drugs, and they can momentarily stop this, but we need really a strong strategy also to prevent that HIV goes back to where we were before there were antiretrovirals. And we can come back later what we can do about that.
Well, thank you. And you know, Peter was just touching on two critical elements. One is, of course, using the drugs appropriately, but also how do we incentivize the pipeline of new products in development. And you know, we're going to now, I think, sort of switch gears a bit to talk more about that. Peter Jackson is going to be describing efforts in the UK that have been really very impressive for all the chaos that Brexit has brought.
I mentioned the B word.
The
Yes.
UK is really a shining example of a nation coming together to focus on a critical public health problem and develop a strategy. And the UK's 5-year national plan and its laying out of strategies to incentivize medical product development, I think is worth some attention. Peter?
Thank you, Peggy. First of all, I'd just like to bring the issue of AMR back home right here to everyone in the room. Because antibiotics don't just treat infections, they underpin every other element of medicine, surgery, C-section, cataract surgery, knee replacement. You go into a hospital, you're going to rely on an effective and you know, really reliable armory of different antibiotics to treat the different diseases. Because if you haven't got them, we're actually almost looking at going back to the early 1900s in how we approach medicine and the control of infection. So that's enough of the doom and gloom. Let's move on to some of the positive things that are happening. Peggy, you mentioned the UK being at the forefront. I think definitely diplomatically and politically, the AMR agenda has been driven from the top in the UK, despite the B word. And the UK has just introduced its second 5-year AMR strategy. And for new drugs, there were two really important elements within that. First of all, after a lot of work by the community, including ourselves in the UK, recognising the importance of small to medium enterprises in this effort. There is no big pharma R&D effort going on at the moment in the UK. Something like 45 new drug programs are in the UK drug development pipeline for AMR. Only 2 of those are from big pharma. The rest of them are small to medium enterprises. So a key part of the new 5-year strategy is actually recognising that and making sure that the appropriate funding streams are put in place to incentivise the early stage research and to help mobilise capital, private capital alongside public capital into this effort. The second really important thing in that strategy was the world's first so-called pull incentive. So just to step back a moment, we want a really good supply of new antibiotics, but then we want to use them sparingly. We only want to use them on the resistant organisms that they're needed for. Otherwise, if we use them widely, we'll simply be repeating the problems of the past and generating new resistant strains for these new drugs. So here's the dilemma. We want biotechs and pharma companies to create new products, but then we don't want them to sell any. So this not only requires incentivization at the research end, the pushing new products into the pipeline, but we need new incentives on the market end the so-called pull, which may be reward, different types of rewards, such as transferable exclusivity, market exclusivity vouchers, for example, which I think is gaining some traction within the European Union and is being discussed in the US. So the UK has actually announced the first pull incentive trial as part of the 5-year strategy. It will take 18 months, and it's built upon some academic and Department of Health work on looking at new valuation models for antibiotics. So not just the immediate value, compared with all the other antibiotics, which may be 50 cents a strip because of years of becoming generic, but actually looking at the value to the whole health system, including the value of preventing further AMR. And when you build all of these elements in, you then start to generate values of new drug prescriptions for an individual patient in the tens of thousands of dollars per course, rather than the small handful of dollars that are currently being reimbursed for the older drugs. Now, it's this sort of incentivization and market reforms and new mechanisms combining the push and the pull that will really make the difference and allow private capital to come back into the sector after years of underinvestment. And I'm really pleased to say that the UK again is at the forefront in experimenting with some of those trials. The AMR Centre, we were formed with exactly the same aim in mind, i.e. to be able to mobilise and combine public, philanthropic and private capital as an aggregator of programmes, so providing funding, real on-the-ground effort in preclinical and preclinical development, and aggregating risk by building a portfolio of assets, but also leveraging grant money and in-kind contributions. It's difficult and expensive to develop any new drug. So what we need to do in the antibiotics field is collaborate as much as possible and put together all the different elements of funding into an overall package that will make the development of new antibiotics affordable and rapid, really generating faster cures that are needed.
Thank you. Well, I think one of the things we need to be clearly focusing on is how to incentivize and also how to be innovative in terms of new classes of drugs and thinking about the approach in new ways. And DARPA has long been known for its ability to do science with thinking outside of the box. And Matt Hepburn is leading an effort at DARPA now to look at what they can contribute to addressing the threat of antimicrobial resistance. And some people ask why Department of Defense, but obviously, it's a national security concern, a threat to our nation and so many others, and it's also a day-to-day threat to the military as well. Absolutely. And it, of course, is also a really important scientific challenge. Absolutely. So maybe you can talk a little bit about your work and your vision.
Happy to.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks, Peggy. It's a privilege to be on this panel, and I think so. This is my first global conference. I'm fairly new to the Faster Cures community. I love it, and I think what I love about this conference is that we take on big problems and we talk about major threats to humanity, but we also talk about the solutions. And I've heard the words change agents and doers and people of action, throughout the last couple days. And I think this is clearly a big challenge. I think you can see from our panel that this is a group that's proposing solutions. You heard about the CDC's AMR challenge as a great case in point. What I want to talk about, I have 3 points on this, and I think it's very much in the spirit of the Faster Cures. What can we do as a community about it? So the first thing I want to address is why is DARPA on the stage here? Let me explain. So I'm an Army infectious diseases physician. I've been a DARPA program manager for 5+ years. I manage our emerging infectious diseases portfolio. And for those of you that aren't aware, DARPA was created after the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, so we're about 60 years old. Our motto is simple: to prevent technological surprise. How do we do that? Breakthrough investments for national security. Is this a national security issue? Well, I can argue that for the next 5 to 7 minutes, and the panel's more articulate than I am. But a policy initiative actually made this very easy for me, and it's called the Combating Antimicrobial Resistant Bacteria Initiative, a national strategy that came out in the previous administration. And so, and one of the key points is that this is a national security priority for us. So now I just have to point to a policy document. And therefore I can pivot my current investments to address this threat. Why am I telling you this? Is because policy is important. And when you have senior leadership that says, this is something that our nation is going to put our resources on, it has this cascading effect. So we have the CDC, again, doing the AMR challenge. But you have DARPA, which traditionally, again, is going to be think about the problem and science and engineering and technology solutions. Now I can pivot all of that DARPA ethos to solving this problem. Furthermore, and I'm glad Peggy brought it up, that personally, the reason that I do what I do as an Army physician is I think a solemn obligation to provide the health care and the protection that we can for a worldwide deployed military. And our worldwide deployed military gets infected with drug-resistant malaria. And our worldwide deployed military gets injured and burned and develops drug-resistant, sometimes pan-resistant bacterial infections, and for which they die from. So we as an American military care very deeply about trying to solve this problem, not as a solo entity, but in really close collaboration across our United States government with our international partners, and certainly with the private sector, with the global community. We play a very small part, but I kind of like the part we play. And in particular in DARPA, let me give you 2 examples briefly of, again, I think when we're at our best, we're the ones who say, let's try to think about this problem completely differently. And if we can do an investment that's disruptive or different, one of our litmus tests, frankly, is that if we originally present an idea and groups laugh at it, especially the subject matter experts, it's like we're on the right track. And I've actually done that. I've been on panels before where and the panelists are laughing at me too. I'm like, we're really on the right track. But let me give you 2 examples. The first is that we have investment now that has said, our infectious diseases paradigm is we have a pathogen and we have to kill it. And what I've said is, why don't we reverse it a little bit and look at how we respond to that infection? We'll call it the host response to infection. And if we can modulate that response, and again, we're taking inspiration now from the cancer community with immunotherapy, but it's not necessarily immunotherapy, but the whole point of titrating, precisely managing that host response to infection, then maybe people won't get sick as long, they won't need antibiotics, we can kick in the immune system at the right time. So that you survive your infection. And the program is to gain inspiration from the animal community, where we have lots of examples of animals who can tolerate high doses of these lethal infections that at very low doses kill us. Think about bats and these different animals that circulate these viruses. Think about mice that can tolerate very high levels of bacteria and they don't get sick. So why is that? So that's a discovery program, and really looking at really how we do sciences differently. We don't want animal models that replicate the humans. We want animal models that do the exact opposite, that survive these infections at very low doses. And the premise is that if we can figure out what that secret sauce is, then we can do titrated specific modulatory therapy so that you survive your infection. It doesn't lend itself very well to a drug. And so the commercial model for ultimately developing this is still a work in progress. But I'm bringing it up because it's a different way to think about the antimicrobial resistance problem. A final example is that I wanted to touch on antibodies very quickly because one of the things that we've been investing in heavily and seen tremendous progress is the ability to rapidly find antibodies that serve a critical function. So if we're talking about an emerging viral infection, rapidly discovering a new antibody against the MERS coronavirus or the Zika virus or the next emerging threat. And when we think about pandemics, in this case, we need speed. But we can also pivot that technology, finding highly potent antibodies, engineering those antibodies to do the purpose of the immune system that we want it to accomplish. So if we want to attract different types of cells at different times to kill that bacteria, maybe we can do so. But then give those antibodies as a specific, rather than a broad, but a very specific targeted way to treat a bacterial infection, as an example. Now, what's the problem with what I've told you? Well, one problem is it may not take one antibody. We may have to make 5 or 6, okay? And the second problem is to make an antibody and to drive that through licensure and approval is really expensive. And when we've talked about the cost versus the benefit, that calculation in the AMR space, we're just not winning it. So the think about the problem differently is that, but what if we could make a small piece of DNA and we could give you a shot in the arm and then convince your muscle cells to make that antibody? Well, if we can make that small piece of DNA at 1/100th or 1,000th of the cost that it would for a traditional antibody, well, now we're making this treatment more affordable. And if that piece of DNA can make 3 antibodies instead of 1, well, then we're really cooking. And so we have a project that's a very nice collaboration with our colleagues in Health and Human Services in the U.S. government, and is a cost share with MedImmune, now AstraZeneca, to develop that concept to see if we can de-risk that at the early level. Will it work? I don't know. But those are the kinds of investment we make. And what I encourage, in my final comment is for us all to think about this problem differently and to work as a partnership, as a community to solve it.
Thank you. Our last panelist, Jeannette Mucha, really is in a very unique position to speak to some of the issues that have been raised. She is the CEO, as I mentioned, of a startup company that is also doing some very innovative work trying to develop a novel therapeutic approach involving the microbiome. So I would really like you to talk to us about both what is this approach and why are you optimistic about what can be accomplished if your company is successful and your science goes forward. But also some of the challenges you grapple with as a young and small startup.
Certainly. So, yeah, we definitely need to try a myriad of different approaches to combating antibiotic resistance, not only new classes of antibiotics and immune modulation and antibodies, et cetera. What CyVac is doing is we're making live biotherapeutics to go after antibiotic-resistant disease. So this really, we're fighting fire with fire. We're using beneficial bacteria to combat pathogens. So CyVac, what that kind of approach does, what the microbiome approach in general does of using live biotherapeutics is that you're treating the infection locally. So you're using the bacteria as little factories of mechanism, allowing them to make bacteriocins, for instance, which are small peptides that poke holes into the pathogen's cell walls to kill them. So you're having them make those products locally, and that reduces your side effects, it reduces the toxicity, and then it can also, one of the problems with antibiotics is that when you take them, they're kind of like, they work like napalm. They go in and they clear your infection, but they also clear out a bunch of your beneficial bacteria in your gut unintentionally. It creates a vacuum, and something will grow to replace what's missing in that vacuum. And oftentimes it's a secondary infection, like C. diff, Clostridium difficile infection. And that is one of the things that we're going after, that we have a CARB-X grant for, but we need, the CARB-X grant works in matching funds, and it's a reimbursement program. It's not like an SBIR that you get it up front. So in order to continue on the program, you have to have an investment partner. And a lot of VC don't understand that. They think, oh, you've got $5 million from CARB-X. You don't know. We need the money up front, and then we'll bring that back. So what makes us different from the other microbiome companies is that we have a technology called Merge that allows us to encourage different species of bacteria or yeast to mate together and to exchange beneficial traits. So one of the limitations of using live biotherapeutics is that many that make therapeutic compounds can't survive inside the human body, or the ones that can, they falter during illness, or they're the pathogen's easily able to compete with it. So we look for therapeutic probiotics, and then we see what they need to be enhanced. Sometimes they need help with their nutritional capabilities. Sometimes they need more therapeutic qualities. And we're able to find other beneficial bacteria that don't necessarily survive inside the human body and pass those traits on, kind of manipulating a natural process that happens and moving those traits into those probiotic strains to make kind of a second generation probiotic or Bugs' drugs. So that's where we're using mechanism to go after our targets, after our pathogens. So for instance, our C. diff therapeutic goes after C. diff 4 different ways. So antibiotics will go after the C. diff with one way, direct killing with a chemical compound. Our therapeutic has 3 different microbes in it. 2 of them make bacteriocins that directly kill the C. diff. One of them also keeps the C. diff, makes a compound that keeps the C. diff from binding to the colon. The other one keeps the C. diff from forming spores, which is one of the main reasons why they persist in hospitals, easily transmitted through spores, and it also causes a recurrence of the disease. And then we have a final piece of the puzzle, which is a hybrid yeast that we've made that can neutralize the toxins that the C. diff makes. And it can consistently neutralize 96% of the C. diff toxins just in a couple hours. So we're kind of trying to hit the pathogen over the head with a hammer, make it more effective, and then also make it less likely that the pathogen will develop resistance.
Wow. In addition to this incredible work that she's doing in the company at the microbial level, she's also about to run her 19th triathlon next week, so very impressive. We're already starting to run out of time, to my horror. I want to go to the audience for questions. I also did, though, want to go from sort of the microbial level now back up to the global level, because this is, the Milken Global Conference. We've heard about exciting activities that are happening, within different national entities, and of course what's happening in the private sector as well. But we all recognize this is a time when there's a growing nationalism, but this is a problem that is global. Microbes travel, people interact, microbes interact. We want real and enduring solutions to this problem, not just a patchwork approach. And that is going to really require global coordination and strategic thinking and action. So I just wanted our panelists to comment on that just a little bit, maybe starting with Peter.
Yeah, I think that's you're absolutely right. And just like what the other Peter said here, the UK has been really campaigning to put antimicrobial resistance at the top of the political agenda in the world. And now there is this alliance, the US is also playing a big role, but it's been discussed at the G8, at the G20, the World Economic Forum, also regional bodies. So at that political level, and I can only remember one other topic in health that has been through that, and that's HIV. And also because it was felt to be a threat to development and so on. And that's really important that continues. It sounds very far from, let's say, a hospital-acquired infection, but it's not, because this needs big budgets. It needs incentives for investment, but also it means that this is not going to be solved by people like us, by epidemiologists and infection control people. You know, it really needs a societal approach. And that's why, like at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, we have an antimicrobial resistance center, and it's co-led by a microbiologist and an anthropologist, and lots of political scientists, and we do a lot of research on prescription behaviors, why do people want antibiotics, and also, let's not forget, there are still hundreds of thousands of people in low-income countries who die because they do not have access to antibiotics. So we should also be careful not to say, oh, antibiotics are bad, because that's something I hear as well sometimes. So it's a very balancing act, but it has to be at the top of the, you know, of the political agendas internationally and nationally in some countries. In the UK, this has been discussed at the level of the Prime Minister of the Cabinet Office, and that's where it should be, because it is a threat to our survival. It's as simple as that.
You want to add any additional thoughts here?
I think the question is about international collaboration and international efforts at the high level. But even at the level that you know, that our centre, our company is operating at, is international, because we have 2 US programs, 1 from Sweden, 2 from the UK, and 1 from Japan. So we have to find the best technology and the best approach from wherever we can get it. And then at the other end, we have to find the patients wherever they are. And of course, these things are not going to be in the same area of the world. So by definition, it needs to be a global effort. But I would say that for all of the political and diplomatic effort, we're only really going to solve the problem when we put in place the necessary reforms to mobilise private capital to solve this. To paraphrase someone who said this to me in the UK, this is far too important an issue to be left to the politicians. So what I would say is, you know, this is primarily an investment community. Just please hear the one message that AMR, new antibiotics, does underpin all of medical science, surgery, life sciences. So do consider putting a small amount of your life science investments into this mission that we all share on the platform.
Great.
And I'd like to comment on that global perspective as well, and kind of go back to what Matt said about this being a national security issue. It is a global security issue. There's an initiative that's called the Global Health Security Agenda. And it is an initiative that more than 60 countries have signed on to, the United States included, to work together to help to address the challenges, the system challenges that exist in countries around the world that make things like antimicrobial resistance such a huge threat to us. So if you think about some of these really, you know, fascinating, novel therapeutics that we've heard about today, you have to think about it in the public health service delivery sector, just as you have to think about, you know, if you have a company, who your consumers are, who your customers are, what are their needs, how do you know what their needs are, and how do you get your product to them? And then how do you assess the effectiveness of your product? The same is true if you're looking at a public health system. So in the Global Health Security Agenda, we work together and we look at the systems in each country. They're objectively assessed by groups of experts, and you identify what those gaps are. So antimicrobial resistance is one of those threats that's looked at. And out of the more than 70 countries that have had their AMR systems assessed, they score on a scale on average from 1 to 5 at about a 2. That's not great. You know, that's not only our threats here, but that's our threats there as well. And so you have to look then at, well, what do we do about that? How do you get your new products? How do you get those to those consumers, those ill individuals that don't have access to antibiotics now, and make sure they're being used appropriately with the right stewardship? We have to look at the laboratory systems to be able to diagnose their infections. So like in Haiti, CDC we work with countries all over the world, and we have offices in more than 60 countries globally, where we're doing not only this kind of work, but working on other critical public health threats. So in Haiti, we've partnered with the national government there, and we've helped them after the devastation that they experienced from the earthquakes to be able to rebuild their laboratory system in a way that has a strong supply chain. So you can get the samples from the remote districts in the country, and you can get them to where they can be tested. So look at tuberculosis. Haiti has the highest rates of tuberculosis in the Americas. And we need to know, are they resistant tuberculosis cases or not? So we've been able to help to build this network together with other partners so those samples can be tested, we've tested more than 30,000 specimens to be able to then diagnose which ones are drug resistant with the gene expert technology. You look at India, that has very high rates of antimicrobial resistance, and we've helped them to put in place surveillance systems to be able to detect in their hospitals urinary tract infections that are antimicrobial resistant, and help them put in place with their primary care providers, both in the private sector and the public sector, through a partnership with PATH, network to help educate those providers on appropriate use of antibiotics. So we have to look at it through all of those different components of the systems. If we create these fabulous new diagnostics, if we don't have the right systems in place to be able to know who needs them where and to assess the impact of them, then we're still going to continue to have challenges.
This is really an example where every country has a vested interest in fact, strengthening capacity and building systems in other countries around the world and this global network. Let me just open it up to the floor quickly. Raise your hand, and I think there's a microphone.
Hi, thank you. Great panel. I'm excited to hear, this is Lance Price from Milken Institute School of Public Health at George Washington University. I run the Antibiotic Resistance Action Center.
I was going to say, and an expert in his own right.
Yeah, it's really exciting to hear about all these exciting new technologies and all the investment in this, but I want to talk about something really simple, water, and water in the developing world. And so we know that when you have poor wastewater treatment, then as people are treated with antibiotics, they defecate drug-resistant bacteria in the water, and then somebody downstream drinks it when you don't have clean drinking water. And this fuels infections, that fuels antibiotic use, but it's also a distribution system. So what's the international community talking about in terms of investments into reaching those sustainable development goals, giving people clean water, and recognizing that India's water problem is our water problem when it comes to drug-resistant bacteria?
Any of you want to comment? It's certainly a very important point. Yeah. Peter?
Well, I think that's, I totally agree with you. That's the point I tried to make also when giving the example of Kibera, one of the biggest slums in the world, and where there are basically hardly any toilets. And then water, everything is fecally contaminated, everything. And so the problem is that I think that problem has been around for many, many years, but I think the AMR story can perhaps concentrate the minds that we need to do also deal with this, water and sanitation. And in India, even Prime Minister Modi has launched a major initiative of building toilets. But in some places there are no toilets, but there's no water. Deal with it. So again, illustrating that you can't just approach this kind of very specific problem in a very narrow mind. That's why we need multiple sectors. That's why we need these partnerships, these coalitions that we have. Another issue is, for example, vaccines are probably one of the best tools against antimicrobial resistance, because if people have fewer infections, there will be less need for antibiotics and so on. So I could agree.
The complex ecosystem.
Yeah.
Let's take a couple more questions. Yes.
Do you think the FDA has been resistant to approving new classes of antibiotics for many years, and that's contributed to the problem?
I guess that might be a question for me, not the panel. But others can comment on the challenges of doing the research needed to assess the efficacy and safety of new antibiotics. I think if you go back a ways, that the structure that was expected in terms of clinical trials and demonstrations of efficacy were very rigorous, but they weren't flexible enough and responsive enough to the realities of what needed to be done in this research. And so I think that the FDA has made enormous strides. I think that they have been working in real partnership with both industry and academia to figure out better ways to do some of the research that needs to be done, and to also help with some of the strategies to incentivize research in this area. So I think continuing work needs to be done. FDA needs to continue to be fully a partner at the table in these efforts. We need the best possible input from the clinical research community, whether in the private sector or in academia, to help figure out better strategies and solutions. But I think real efforts have been made within the FDA to prioritize this area. And I would say FDA also, in the AMR context, has made real progress after decades of really being stalled to address the issues of antibiotic use in animal agriculture and animal husbandry, and really starting to limit the use of antibiotics for growth promotion, and introducing requirements for veterinary oversight of the use of antibiotics in animal husbandry. So I think progress has been made, but it's an ongoing challenge. Let's see. I think one more question. Yes.
I was very intrigued to hear about you must use these drugs more sparingly in the future, and they have to find ways of incentivization. That probably brings me to another question I have in relation to that. Obviously, we all know there's actors around the world that will copy drugs where they can and not use them so sparingly. Should we be entering an age of sealed patents in this area?
Who wants to take that one? Sealed patents? Yeah. I don't feel that's my area of expertise, although I may be closer to some of those issues than some others. I was looking.
You want me to step forward, right?
This isn't your legal community. The UK has a different framework, but I think the point is that. Well, I think that there has been an ongoing struggle to figure out what is the right incentive structure, both the push and the pull, and the ability to guarantee markets for companies. And we've seen some unfortunate recent things, in fact, that some of the strategies that we were starting to feel very good about may not be working that well either. A company, we were just talking about this yesterday evening, that had been supported through this CARB-X innovative mechanism to bring new funding to develop new products, actually was able to develop a new antibiotic and get it through the system and get it approved, but because of a number of factors, it hasn't been able to effectively sell the product. It hasn't been taken up into use. both issues of cost and perhaps indications for use, and education of the provider community as well. And the company, I understand, has just gone out of business. So, you know, you just made the comment about how important bringing capital in to the process is, and I think, you know, we really need to continue to work on our models.
I think we need to understand the reasons for that. We need to develop new drugs much more cost effectively. And I think, touching on your question and some of the things I mentioned earlier, part of the problem, we do have to go to countries where the patients are at the moment, which also could be a challenge for the US and European regulators if you're conducting trials in remote regions of China, for example, because that's where the particular resistant strain of bug is endemic. It fundamentally comes back to the need for international collaboration on this. You know, we can't find the patients, the numbers of patients yet in the US or certainly in the UK, in Europe, so we have to go where the patients are. That means that the first use of those drugs is going to be in those areas, should be in those areas where the biggest number of patients are, as well as being available in more developed markets. So going down the track of putting barriers around international collaboration and international uptake of those drugs is counter to the direction of travel that I think we need to be going in, and I think it's much more about making sure we've got robust protection of our intellectual property in those markets, and actually as those markets develop and become more wealthy, which is a big theme of this conference, that investors can actually start to make money out of those markets, as well as providing the societal good that these products will deliver.
All right, well, I'm getting signs, session closed, flashed at me. We do need to end. I think our speakers could make themselves available for additional questions and discussion as we move out into the lobby area. But thank you all. Thanks for a wonderful panel.